in the heart of 16th century Europe. The air was thick with the scent of burning books and the whispers of revolution. It was a time when the old world was crumbling and the new was struggling to break free. In the midst of this turmoil stood a young man named John Calvin, whose words would soon ignite a fire that could not be quenched. Calvin was not a warrior or a king. He was a theologian, a thinker, and a man of deep faith. But in 1537, he was a nobody, a refugee from France, living in the small city of Geneva. His only weapon was his pen, and his only shield was his unwavering belief in the Word of God. One day, a letter arrived for Calvin from a friend, Nicolas Duchemin. Duchemin was torn between his love for God and his fear of the world. He was a man caught in a web of doubt and hesitation, unsure whether to stand firm in his faith or to conform to the old ways of the Church. Calvin knew that Duchemin was not alone. Many in France were struggling with the same questions, and the stakes were high. To choose the wrong path could mean death, both spiritual and physical. Calvin sat down to write, his heart heavy with the weight of his friend's dilemma. He knew that his words could make a difference, but he also knew that they could be dangerous. In a world where heresy was punished with fire and sword, every letter could be a matter of life and death. "Dear Nicolas," he began, "I write to you not as a friend, but as a brother in Christ. You are facing a choice that will define your life and your soul. You must decide whether to follow the true God or to bow down to the false idols of this world." Calvin's words were sharp, but they came from a place of deep compassion. He understood the fear and uncertainty that Duchemin felt. Calvin himself had once walked that same path, torn between his love for God and his fear of persecution. But he had made his choice, and he knew that Duchemin must do the same. "You have been taught that the Mass is a sacred ritual, a means of grace," Calvin wrote. "But I tell you it is an abomination, a lie that pollutes the very name of God. To participate in it is to betray the faith that you claim to hold dear." Calvin's words were like a thunderbolt, striking at the very core of Duchemin's beliefs. He knew that his friend would be shaken by these words, but he also knew that the truth must be spoken, no matter the cost. "You must stand firm in the face of persecution," Calvin continued. "You must be willing to risk everything for the sake of your faith, for the true God demands nothing less. He is a jealous God, and he will not share your devotion with any other." Calvin's letter was a call to action, a challenge to Duchemin to choose between God and the world. It was a choice that would not be easy, but it was a choice that had to be made. As Calvin finished his letter, he felt a sense of relief. He had spoken the truth, and now it was up to Duchemin to decide, but he also felt a deep sense of responsibility. He knew that his words could change lives, and he prayed that they would lead Duchemin and others like him closer to the true God. The next day, Calvin sent the letter to Duchemin, and the fire of conscience was lit. It would spread far beyond the borders of Geneva, igniting a revolution that would change the course of history. But for now, Calvin could only wait and hope that his words would find the right hearts. In the shadows, another letter was being prepared, this one to a man who had once been a friend, but was now an enemy. Gerard Roussel, a former reformer, had chosen the path of compromise, accepting a position within the very church he once sought to reform. Calvin's letter to Roussel would be different, bitter, sarcastic, and full of fire. But that was a story for another day. For now the fire of conscience burned bright in the heart of Geneva, and the world would never be the same. On August 23, 1535, a young Frenchman named John Calvin finished writing a bold letter to King Francis I of France. This letter was a plea for tolerance and a defense of the growing Protestant faith. Calvin argued that the Reformation was not a rebellion, but a return to the true teachings of the early Christian Church. He believed that the Roman Catholic Church had strayed from these teachings, and that the Bible should be the ultimate authority. Calvin often cited early church leaders like Augustine, Jerome, and Ambrose to support his arguments. He wanted to show that his views were grounded in historical Christian tradition. For example, he wrote, "There was a father, there were fathers. There was a father who denied, there was a father who held," emphasizing that even in the early church there were disagreements and different interpretation. Calvin's journey to becoming a Protestant reformer was long and complex. He was born in 1509 in Noyon, France, and his father Gerard planned for him to become a lawyer. Calvin studied in Paris, Orleans, and Bourges, where he developed a love for literature and humanism. By the early 1530s, he was eager to become a famous humanist, but his plans changed when he became deeply interested in the ideas of the Reformation. In 1525, a group of reform-minded people in Meaux, led by Bishop Guillaume Briconnet, was disbanded for their beliefs. This event, along with the execution of the humanist Louis de Berquin in 1529, showed Calvin the dangers of openly supporting reform. In 1531, Calvin's father died, and Calvin decided to focus on his literary ambitions. He published a commentary on Seneca's De Clementia in 1532, but it did not gain the recognition he hoped for. The next few years were turbulent. In 1533, Nicolas Duchemin, the rector of the University of Paris, gave a sermon that was seen as supporting Lutheranism. This led to a crackdown on Protestants, and Calvin had to flee Paris. He visited his hometown of Noyon in 1533, but returned to Paris under the protection of Marguerite de Navarre, the king's sister. In 1534, Calvin renounced his position in the Catholic Church, marking a significant break with his past. The exact date of Calvin's conversion to Protestantism is uncertain, but it likely happened around 1532. He described his experience as a sudden conversion that led him to embrace pure doctrine. His first work as a Protestant, Psychopannychia, was a defense of the evangelical view of the soul against the Anabaptists. Calvin also wrote the preface for his cousin Pierre Robert Olivetan's French translation of the Bible, which showcased his developing theological and literary skills. In 1536, Calvin published his Institutes of the Christian Religion, which became a foundational text for the Reformation. He planned to retreat to a quiet life in Germany, but was persuaded to stay in Geneva by the zealous reformer Guillaume Farel. Calvin's time in Geneva was marked by intense work and conflict, but it also saw the publication of the two letters. The two letters were written to address the issue of Nicodemism, a term referring to people who secretly held Protestant beliefs while outwardly practicing Catholicism. The term comes from the biblical figure Nicodemus, who visited Jesus at night, symbolizing fear or discretion. Calvin was particularly critical of those who remained in leadership positions within the Catholic Church while secretly supporting Protestant ideas. One of the key figures Calvin addressed was Gerard Roussel, a former friend who had influenced Calvin's early religious views. Calvin and Roussel had a deep personal relationship, but their paths diverged as Roussel continued to work within the Catholic Church. Calvin also wrote to Nicolas Duchemin, another former friend, who had also chosen to remain in the Catholic Church. Calvin's letters to Duchemin and Roussel were both a plea and a rebuke. He wanted to convince them that their secret beliefs were not enough, and that they should openly embrace the Protestant faith. Calvin believed that true faith required public confession and active participation in the life of the Church. His letters were a powerful expression of his convictions and a testament to the personal and theological struggles of the early Reformation. The friendship between John Calvin and Jean Duchemin, or Duchemin, is a bit of a mystery. We don't have many documents that tell us about their relationship, but historians de Boer and Van Steen have some ideas. They think Duchemin was a law student at the University of Orleans, about 5 years older than Calvin. Duchemin came from a wealthy French family and was probably quite generous to Calvin, maybe even lending him money and offering him a place to stay. Duchemin later became a priest and a canon in 1534. He moved to Le Mans, where he worked in the church court. Some say he might have been involved in bringing charges against people who believed in new religious ideas, like Lutheranism. However, de Boer and Van Steen think the bishop in Le Mans was actually quite lenient and didn't mind these new ideas. This means that when Calvin wrote to Duchemin, he was addressing a longtime friend who had a decent position in both society and the church, where new ideas were sometimes tolerated. But Calvin's first letter to Duchemin is very critical, which makes it even more interesting. Gerard Roussel, the person Calvin addresses in the second letter, is a different story. We know a lot more about him, especially from letters he wrote to a man named Farel. Roussel and Farel had been friends for a long time, even before they both became interested in the new religious ideas spreading through France. They had met in the early 1500s at the College of Cardinal Lemoyne, where they both studied humanism, which was a way of thinking that focused on classical texts and the importance of human dignity. Roussel was a talented preacher and had the support of Queen Marguerite de Navarre, who was also interested in these new ideas. For a while, Roussel was very successful in promoting these changes, and people who followed him were called Girondini, but as the Sorbonne theologians, who were very powerful and conservative, started to notice what was happening, Roussel became a target. They even made fun of him and Queen Marguerite in a play, where Roussel was shown as forcing his ideas on the Queen, who then became a fanatic. Despite all the trouble, Roussel managed to stay safe and even got promoted. In 1535, he became the Bishop of Oloron, a position he held until 1555. This is surprising because many others who promoted these new ideas ended up as martyrs. Calvin believed that Roussel and others like him were motivated by greed and ambition, and that once they had comfortable positions, they lost their courage and commitment to the gospel. Calvin felt deeply betrayed by Roussel because he remembered Roussel's earlier dedication to reform. In a letter from 1524, Roussel's friend Nicolas Duchemin wrote to Farel, praising Roussel's preaching and how he never held back from teaching the truth. Roussel himself wrote to Farel about the dangers he faced and how he had to be careful and even deceptive to keep preaching. But as time went on, Calvin saw Roussel as someone who had given in to the pressures of the church and abandoned his earlier beliefs. For Calvin, the worst sin was not just disagreeing about religious ideas, but pretending to worship in a way that he believed was false. Calvin thought that participating in the Mass, which was a central part of Catholic worship, was a form of idolatry. He was especially upset by those who pretended to be loyal to the new ideas while still going to Mass to avoid trouble. This was called Nicodemism, and Calvin saw it as a serious threat to the Protestant movement. Despite Calvin's harsh criticism, Roussel continued to work on reform in his own way. He wrote books on important Christian teachings and tried to change practices like the veneration of saints and the way confession was handled. Even though his efforts were often met with resistance, he kept pushing for what he believed was right. Calvin's writing style, in his letters to Duchemin and Roussel, is very passionate and often harsh. He uses strong emotional language to make his points. For example, he describes the Mass as a form of idolatry and says that a small piece of bread is treated as if it were God. This kind of writing shows how deeply he felt about the issues and how much he wanted to persuade his friends to stay true to their earlier beliefs. Calvin's style is complex and filled with rhetorical devices, making his arguments powerful and memorable. The text we're looking at is from a letter by John Calvin, a very important figure in the Reformation. The part we're focusing on has a few key elements that show how Calvin writes in a way that's both clever and pointed. First, Calvin starts with Deus, which means God in Latin, right after a sentence that starts with pro Deo, which means for God. This switch is a subtle way to draw attention to what he's saying. He then contrasts Deus with panis crustulum, which means a crust of bread. This contrast helps Calvin make fun of the idea that the bread used in the Mass can actually turn into God. The word denique, which means finally or at last, tells us that Calvin is wrapping up his argument. He ends with a strong statement. No pagan ever believed this about his statues. This is Calvin's way of saying that even ancient pagans who worship statues didn't believe that their statues could turn into gods. He's using this to show how ridiculous he thinks the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation is. Calvin's writing is very sophisticated, and it shows that he's not just making a simple point, but is also showing off his skills. This is a style that continues throughout his work, as noted by scholars like Ford Lewis Battles. Now let's compare this to another part of Calvin's writing, the opening of his Institutes of the Christian Religion, which he wrote in 1536. This part is addressed to King Francis I of France. Here Calvin writes, "When I first set my hand to this work, most noble king, the furthest thought from my mind was to write something that I could offer to your majesty. My sole intention was to set down some basic notions by which those who were affected with any desire for true faith could be shaped toward true religion." This is very different from the letter we looked at earlier. Calvin is writing to a king, so his language is much more formal and polite. He uses a lot of fancy words and a very structured sentence style. This is typical of the kind of writing you would use when addressing a king, where you want to be respectful and persuasive. The difference between these two pieces of writing shows how Calvin can adapt his style to different audiences. When he's writing to a broad audience or a king, he uses a more formal and persuasive style. When he's writing to friends or in a more personal context, his writing is simpler and more direct. For example, in a letter to his friend William Farel from 1539, Calvin writes, "Certain other disagreements had to be settled, and I had to make some answer to more than 10 people interrupting me." This letter is much simpler and more straightforward. Calvin is just describing his busy day, and he doesn't try to make it sound fancy. This shows that Calvin can write in different ways depending on who he's writing to and what he's trying to say. Finally, it's worth noting that the letters and writings we've looked at are structured in a way that helps the reader follow the argument. The editors of Calvin's works have added headings to make it easier to navigate, but these weren't in the original texts. Calvin's original writing was continuous and required careful reading to understand. Overall, Calvin's writing shows a lot of skill and adaptability. Whether he's writing to a king, a friend, or a broad audience, he can change his style to fit the situation and make his points effectively. John Calvin, a man of deep faith and wisdom, wrote letters that spoke directly to the hearts of those who read them. One of these letters, addressed to a close friend, captures the urgency and passion of his message. Calvin's friend, like many others, was stuck in a place filled with practices that went against the true teachings of Christianity. Calvin wanted to help his friend see the truth and find the courage to leave that environment. Calvin began his letter by expressing his deep concern for his friend. He wrote, "I am filled with the greatest anxiety for you. I feel compassion for your plight." He understood the struggle of being surrounded by things that were against God's will. Calvin knew that seeing such things could be deeply troubling, especially for someone who cared about their faith. Calvin's friend was in a place that Calvin compared to Egypt, a land of idols and idolatry. He described the environment as one where shameful displays of wickedness among the monks and petty priests were common. There were thousands of superstitions among the people and countless mockeries of true religion. Calvin believed that these practices were not just harmful, but also offensive to those who truly loved God. Calvin emphasized the importance of the sense of sight. He wrote, "The sense of sight is the most sensitive and is the most profoundly affected." He knew that seeing these things could have a deep impact on a person's faith and well-being. He imagined that those who could avoid such sights must be happier, while his friend's distress was truly miserable. Calvin's letter was not just a complaint, it was a call to action. He encouraged his friend to remember that the truth and the doctrine of life were set before him. Calvin wrote, "The only way to commend this properly is by obedience. May they also realize that this doctrine is the Word of God. If they treat it like a game, they will not go unpunished." He wanted his friend to understand that the teachings of the Bible were not just words, but a guide for living a life that honored God. Calvin quoted the prophet Ezekiel to drive home his point. He wrote, "The Lord said to the prophet, 'They come to you in mobs. They sit before you, and they listen to your words, but they do not follow them. For it is only a game in their mouth, and their heart is bent on greed. So you have become to them nothing more than a playful song, a sweet melody, since they keep their ears trained on your words, but do not bother to follow them. Yet when the time comes, which certainly is almost here, they will know that a prophet has been among them." Calvin wanted his friend to take the message seriously and not treat it as something trivial. Calvin's letter was a heartfelt plea to his friend to leave the environment that was corrupting his faith. He knew that it would not be easy, but he believed that it was necessary to maintain the purity of the Christian faith. Calvin's words were a reminder that sometimes, to stay true to one's beliefs, one must be willing to make difficult choices. Calvin's letter was more than just a personal message. It was a call to all who read it to examine their own lives and to stand firm in their faith, no matter the cost. The Mass, which some sees the most sacred part of their faith, can also be a source of deep concern. It's presented as something to marvel at, but for many, it represents a serious problem, one that can feel like a deep insult to God. When faced with such a situation, it's natural to feel angry, or even to shed tears. But the real challenge is figuring out how to stay true to your beliefs in a world that often seems to go against them. Imagine you're in a place where you have to live among people who don't share your values. It can be tempting to pretend to agree with them just to keep the peace. After all, it's easier to go along with the crowd than to stand out and face conflict. But this approach is dangerous. When you start to compromise a little, it's easy to keep compromising more and more. Before you know it, you might find yourself doing things that you know are wrong just to fit in. There are many examples of people who started out thinking they could handle a little compromise. They told themselves they would only pretend to agree with the wrong things on the surface, but deep down they would stay true to their faith. But over time, these small compromises led to bigger ones. They started to participate in ceremonies and practices that went against their beliefs. They even began to agree with false teachings, both in private and in public. In the end, they lost sight of who they were and what they stood for. This is a warning to all of us. When we try to navigate difficult situations by compromising our faith, we risk losing everything that matters most. God sees through our attempts to deceive, and He will not be fooled. Instead of trying to find a middle ground that satisfies both God and the world, we need to stay true to God's commands, no matter how hard it might be. It's not easy to stand firm in your faith, especially when you're surrounded by people who don't understand or support you. But the example of Cyprian, a man who was willing to die rather than deny his faith, shows us what true commitment looks like. When faced with the choice between life and death, Cyprian didn't hesitate. He knew that obeying God's command to confess his faith was more important than anything else. This is the kind of determination we need to have in our own lives. When you face difficult choices, remember that every command of God is holy and should be treated with the utmost respect. Don't start questioning whether you should obey, because once you do, you're already on a slippery slope. Instead, focus on God's commands and trust that He will give you the strength to follow them, even when it's hard. In our daily lives, we don't all have to be public preachers or leaders. Each of us has a unique role to play, and that role depends on our individual circumstances and responsibilities. Some people are called to speak openly about their faith, while others are called to live it out in more private ways. The important thing is to be true to who you are and to the faith you hold. So, when you find yourself in a situation where your faith is tested, remember that your primary obligation is to God. Don't try to find a way to keep both God's favor and the approval of the world. Instead, focus on honoring God in everything you do, even if it means standing alone. This might seem difficult, but it's the only way to stay true to the faith and to the God who loves you. The Bible teaches us how to live as followers of Jesus, even when we are surrounded by people who don't believe in God. This can be challenging, but it's important to understand what the Scriptures say about it. When the Lord gave His laws to the people of Israel, He made it clear that they should not worship idols. An idol is anything that people treat as if it were God, even though it isn't. The Lord said, "Do not bow down to them or worship them." Exodus chapter 20, verse 5. This means that the people of Israel should not show any sign of respect to idols, like bowing or kneeling. In the Old Testament, there are many examples of people who lived faithfully even when they were among those who worshipped idols. For instance, the prophet Daniel and his friends refused to bow down to the king's statue, even though it meant they might be thrown into a fiery furnace. They believed that pleasing God was more important than pleasing the king. Similarly, Daniel chose to pray to God openly, even though it meant he might be thrown into a den of lions. These examples show us that we should be willing to stand up for our faith, no matter the cost. The New Testament also gives us guidance on how to live as Christians in a world that doesn't always understand or accept our beliefs. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthians, "Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies." 1 Corinthians 6:19-20. This means that our bodies belong to God, and we should use them to glorify Him, not to participate in practices that dishonor Him. Paul also warned against being yoked with unbelievers. 2 Corinthians 6:14. This doesn't mean we should avoid all contact with non-believers. Instead, it means we shouldn't become so closely involved with them that we start to imitate their practices, especially if those practices go against God's teachings. For example, if our friends are doing something that we know is wrong, we shouldn't join in just to fit in. We should stand firm in our faith and show others what it means to follow Jesus. Sometimes, living as a Christian can be difficult, especially when it means going against the crowd. But the Bible encourages us to be strong and courageous. In the book of Joshua, God said, "Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go." Joshua chapter 1, verse 7. This means that we should stay true to God's word and not give in to the pressure to compromise our beliefs. Living as a Christian in a world that doesn't always understand or accept our faith can be challenging, but it's also a powerful way to show others what it means to follow Jesus. By living our lives with integrity and love, we can be a light to those around us and point them to the truth of God's love. As we journey through the pages of this book, we've explored the deep questions that Paul raises in his letters to the Corinthians. These questions are not just ancient history. They are as relevant today as they were when the apostle first penned them. Paul's teachings challenge us to look deeply at our beliefs and actions, especially when it comes to how we live out our faith in a world that often doesn't understand or accept it. In the early Christian communities, believers faced a dilemma. On one side, some argued that since idols are nothing, it was fine to participate in practices that seemed harmless, like eating food offered to idols. On the other side, others worried that such actions could lead weaker believers astray, causing them to stumble in their faith. Paul's response was clear. While knowledge puffs up, love builds up. True wisdom isn't just about knowing what is right. It's about using that knowledge in a way that strengthens and supports others. Paul acknowledged that idols have no power, but he also recognized that for many, the worship of these idols was very real. When believers with stronger faith participated in these practices, it could send a confusing message to those who were still learning. The apostle urged the Corinthians to be mindful of their weaker brothers and sisters, to avoid actions that might cause them to fall into sin. He reminded them that even if an idol is nothing, the impact of their actions on others is very real. This principle extends beyond the specific issue of idols. It's about how we live our lives in a way that honors God and doesn't lead others astray. Whether it's the way we speak, the decisions we make, or the company we keep, our actions have the power to influence those around us. Paul's message is a call to be intentional, to consider the impact of our choices on others, and to act with love and compassion. In the early church, believers sometimes had to make difficult decisions about how to confess their faith. Some chose to keep their beliefs private to avoid persecution, while others boldly proclaimed their faith, even at great personal cost. Paul's teachings remind us that while the specifics of how we confess our faith may vary, the core principle remains the same. We must never compromise our commitment to the truth of the gospel. Our faith should be lived out in every aspect of our lives, not just in words, but in actions. When it comes to practices that are incompatible with our faith, Paul is firm. He warns against participating in rituals that, even if they seem harmless, can lead to deeper forms of idolatry. Whether it's the veneration of images, the purchase of indulgences, or other practices that blur the line between true worship and superstition, Paul's message is clear. We must avoid anything that could defile our conscience or lead others astray. The Mass, a central practice in many Christian traditions, serves as a powerful example. Paul's teachings challenge us to examine whether our participation in any ritual, no matter how revered, aligns with the pure and true worship of God. If a practice leads to confusion, idolatry, or harm to others, it is not something we should engage in, no matter how deeply rooted it is in tradition. In the end, Paul's message is one of love, wisdom, and integrity. He calls us to live our faith with a deep sense of responsibility, to consider the impact of our actions on others, and to avoid anything that could compromise our commitment to the truth. As we close this chapter, let's take Paul's teachings to heart. Let's strive to live our lives in a way that honors God and builds up the community around us. In a world that often seems divided and confused, our actions can be a powerful witness to the love and truth of Christ.